The evening was thick with tension. The streets of the city, usually bustling with life, had quieted down, save for the occasional distant honk of a car. Officer Daniel Carter had been on edge all day. His shift was nearly over when he spotted a lone figure crossing the dimly lit intersection. The man moved slowly, his posture slightly hunched. He wore an old, weathered coat, and his face, partially obscured by the streetlight's glow, bore the signs of age. To Carter, he looked suspicious. Was he homeless? A drifter? A troublemaker? The officer's instincts, sharpened by years of patrol duty, told him to intervene. "Hey, stop right there," Carter commanded, his hand moving toward his baton. The old man paused but didn't speak. He simply looked at the officer, his deep-set eyes unreadable. Frustrated by the silence, Carter closed the distance and grabbed the man's arm, roughly. What happened next sent a shockwave through the entire police department. As Officer Carter yanked the old man's arm, something unexpected happened. The man, with surprising agility for his age, twisted out of Carter's grip and turned to face him. There was an almost eerie calm in his movements, a quiet authority that didn't belong to someone who appeared to be just a frail, elderly man. "Let go of me," the old man said, his voice low but firm. Carter was taken aback, momentarily thrown off guard by the defiance in the man's tone. But anger quickly replaced his uncertainty. "Do you think you can talk to me like that? I'm an officer of the law," Carter growled, raising his baton. Without warning, the old man's hand shot out. The officer barely had time to react before a sharp pressure gripped his wrist. The old man's fingers were like steel, twisting the baton from Carter's grasp with alarming ease. In that split second, Carter's eyes widened. This wasn't just any old man. There was something unsettling about him. Something far beyond what the officer had first assumed. What the hell are you?" Carter stammered, stepping back, the realization dawning on him that he had made a grave mistake. The old man said nothing. Instead, he slowly removed his glasses, revealing eyes that were not only sharp but full of experience, eyes that had seen more than Carter could ever imagine. He was no longer the frail figure that had first met the officer's gaze. There was power in the man's presence now. A power that demanded respect. Just then, a car pulled up, the lights flickered, casting a shadow over the scene, and a familiar face emerged from the driver's side, Captain Matthew Barnes. Carter's superior. "Carter, what the hell is going on here?" Barnes shouted as he approached. His eyes darted between Carter and the old man, trying to make sense of the situation. Before Carter could respond, the old man spoke again, his voice now carrying the weight of authority. "I suggest you calm down, Captain Barnes, and reconsider your actions. After all, you don't want to make an enemy of someone who has the power to bring this whole city to its knees." Barnes froze, his eyes narrowing. Something clicked in his mind. His face turned pale, and he straightened up, the earlier tension in his posture vanishing as if it had been replaced by fear. "Colonel, is that you?" Barnes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I never wanted anyone to know. But it seems you forced my hand." Carter, still reeling from the shock of the encounter, stood frozen, unable to process what was unfolding before him. This man, this frail old man, was a colonel, and not just any colonel, one whose name was whispered in hushed tones, whose influence stretched far beyond what Carter could have ever imagined. What do you mean? Who are you really?" Carter stammered, feeling the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The colonel looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "I am someone who has lived a life most men could only dream of. But my past is not for you to understand. Just know that your actions tonight, Officer Carter, will have consequences." Barnes stepped forward, his voice now filled with a deep respect. We had no idea. If we had known who you were, we would have acted differently." The colonel shook his head slowly. "It's too late for apologies now." And with that, the evening took a turn that no one in the city could have ever predicted. The shockwaves from that single encounter would ripple through the police department, the city, and beyond, setting in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of history. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Carter still stood frozen, trying to reconcile the man he just manhandled with the legendary colonel who now stood before them. "Colonel," You've been hiding in plain sight all these years?" Barnes asked, his voice shaking slightly, as if he were trying to come to terms with the reality of it all. The colonel's gaze softened, but there was no trace of humor in his expression. "Hiding? No. I've been watching, observing." He glanced briefly at Carter, who was now visibly ashamed, his hands trembling. "The world has changed, Captain. People change, but there are things that never go away, no matter how hard you try to bury them." A long silence followed. Carter wanted to say something, apologize, perhaps, but the words caught in his throat. He knew nothing he could say would undo the mistake he had just made. The colonel broke the silence first. "This city, this system, it's been compromised in ways you can't even begin to fathom. But tonight, you both have a choice." His voice, though calm, was filled with a quiet power. "You can pretend nothing has happened, or you can face the consequences of your actions." Barnes nodded slowly, now fully aware that they were standing on the precipice of something monumental. "What do you want from us?" The colonel turned his eyes to Barnes, and there was a dangerous glint in them, like the calm before a storm. "I need you to help me. To clean up the mess that's been festering under the surface for too long. The corruption, the lies, the people pulling the strings from the shadows." Carter's mind raced. He had been a good cop, followed the rules, kept his head down, but now, he was realizing that those rules might have been a lie all along. The world he thought he knew, his city, his career, was nothing like he had imagined. The colonel was right. Nothing was as it seemed. "What's the plan?" Barnes asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. The colonel took a step forward, his eyes now burning with intensity. "The plan is simple. We expose everything, we find the truth, and we take down the people responsible. But we do it carefully. If we go too fast, we risk it all." Barnes hesitated for a moment, glancing at Carter, who was still processing the events that had unfolded in the last few minutes. Then, with a deep breath, the captain spoke again. "What do you need from us?" The colonel's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "I need the two of you to do something you've never done before, trust me. And follow my lead." Carter swallowed hard. The weight of the decision settled on his chest, suffocating him. He had been raised to believe in right and wrong, but the lines had just blurred. He looked at Barnes, who nodded, as though acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "All right," Barnes said, "we're in. What's our first move?" The colonel's eyes darkened, and for the first time since their meeting, there was a hint of urgency in his voice. "We don't have much time. We need to get to the safe house. There's information there, and it's the only chance we have to begin unraveling everything. If we're lucky, we'll be able to stay one step ahead of them." "Who are they?" Carter finally asked, his voice a mix of fear and curiosity. The colonel looked at him, the shadows in his eyes deepening. "The people who have controlled this city for far too long. They don't just pull strings, they control the fate of everyone in it. And it's time someone stopped them." The tension was palpable as the trio made their way toward the safe house. Carter's mind was a whirlpool of confusion, anger, and fear. How had his life become tangled in a web of deception so quickly? And who exactly was this colonel? This man who seemed to hold so many secrets? As they reached the outskirts of the city, the colonel stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "We have company," he whispered, before Carter could ask what he meant. The unmistakable sound of approaching engines filled the air. The streetlights flickered as shadows loomed in the distance. Something told Carter that they were about to face the very people the colonel had warned them about. "Stay close," the colonel ordered, his voice now a low, commanding growl. The three of them dove into an alley, blending into the darkness, as several black SUVs rolled past, their headlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Carter's heart raced in his chest. He didn't know who they were, but the cold sense of danger was overwhelming. "They're here," the colonel muttered under his breath. "Time's running out." The SUVs slowed as they approached the intersection, their tinted windows masking the occupants inside. Carter's pulse quickened, his fingers instinctively reached for his gun, but the colonel stopped him with a sharp look. "Don't be hasty," the colonel murmured. "Patience is the key now. If they don't know we're here, we have the advantage." Carter could barely contain his nerves. He had never been in a situation like this before. There was always a clear right and wrong in his world. The law was black and white. But here, in the darkness of this alley, It felt as though they were walking a razor-thin line between survival and oblivion. The vehicles stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the distant hum of the city. Then, the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming echoed through the night. 3 men stepped out of the SUVs, all dressed in black suits. Their movements smooth and calculated. They had the air of men who were used to being in control. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "It's them," he whispered, barely audible. "Who are they?" Carter asked, his voice low, tense. "Operatives from the highest level," the colonel replied. "They work for those who control the city from the shadows. People who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. They're the ones I've been hunting for years." Barnes peered out from behind the corner of the alley. His jaw tightened as he surveyed the situation. "How many of them are there?" The colonel counted silently, then spoke. 3 for now, but there will be more. We need to move before they start searching this block." The 3 men in suits began scanning the area, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow. One of them, the tallest, moved toward the entrance of the alley. His footsteps were methodical, deliberate. Carter's breath caught in his throat as the man drew closer. But the colonel was already a step ahead. "Now," he muttered, and the 3 of them slipped deeper into the shadows, moving as silently as possible. They hugged the sides of the buildings, the sound of their feet barely audible on the concrete. Carter's mind raced. Who were these men, really? And what had he gotten himself into by following the colonel's lead? As they moved farther into the alley, they reached a rusted door. The colonel approached it, pressing his ear to it for a moment before nodding. With a swift motion, he pulled a keycard from his pocket and slid it into the lock. The door clicked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading underground. "We'll be safe here for now," the colonel said as he motioned for them to follow him down. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the cold, dimly lit basement. It smelled like old paper and dust, the air thick with the history of whatever had once been stored here. The colonel led them to a heavy steel door at the far end of the basement and swiped another card, opening it with a quiet beep. Inside was a small, sparse room, illuminated only by a single hanging light bulb. On a table in the center of the room, a few scattered papers were spread out. A projector sat in the corner, its lens dimly glowing. "Sit," the colonel ordered, his voice firm. They took their seats at the table, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something. Something big. "What now?" Barnes asked, his voice heavy with tension. The colonel set a file on the table and slid it toward them. "This is where it starts. The first step in exposing them. The people in those SUVs are just pawns. The ones pulling the strings are much more dangerous." Carter's eyes flicked to the file. The name at the top of the first page made his stomach drop. It was a name he had heard only in whispers. A name that carried with it fear and rumors of corruption on a scale that seemed impossible to believe. "Who is this?" Carter asked, his voice barely a whisper. The colonel looked at him with a grim expression. "You'll find out soon enough. This is the person behind everything. The one who controls the city. The one who's been orchestrating everything from the shadows. The puppet master. And if we don't act quickly, this city, and everything you believe in, will be destroyed." The air in the room grew heavier with the weight of his words. Barnes leaned forward, his eyes scanning the document. "We can't let this go any further," Barnes said, determination rising in his voice. "What's our next move?" The colonel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, walked over to the projector, and flicked it on. The image on the wall flickered to life, showing a map of the city with various locations marked in red. Carter's heart pounded as he recognized some of the locations. These were key sites, government buildings, police stations, banks. "These are their strongholds," the colonel explained, his voice colder now. "And we're going to take them down, one by one. But we can't do it alone. We need allies." Barnes nodded. "We'll reach out to the right people. The ones we can trust." The colonel's eyes darkened. "Trust will be a luxury we don't have much of anymore. The enemy is already closing in. And once they realize what we're doing, they won't hesitate to strike back." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. "How do we stay one step ahead?" The colonel turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "We move fast, and we move carefully. And when the time comes, we'll need to make sure we're ready to fight back. This is bigger than anything you've faced." "Officer Carter," But if we succeed, the city can finally be free." The tension was palpable in the room as the team prepared for the storm that was coming. They had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. But they were committed now. What started as a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into a conspiracy that would change everything. And so, they began their mission, unbeknownst to anyone else. The storm was about to break. The hours seemed to stretch on as the trio finalized their plan. The colonel had mapped out their first target, a high-ranking politician known for his ties to criminal organizations. His residence was a fortress, guarded by private security and a slew of loyalists. But the colonel had seen worse. And he made it clear that there was no turning back now. "We strike tonight," the colonel said, his voice low but resolute. "The sooner we disrupt their operations, the better." Carter could feel the weight of the decision in his chest. This wasn't just a raid, this was the beginning of something much bigger. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was part of a rebellion. A mission to expose the corruption that had festered in the city for far too long. "You sure about this, Colonel?" Barnes asked, his hand resting on the map. "This guy's untouchable. If we mess this up, they'll come after us with everything they have." The colonel's eyes flicked to Barnes. "We don't have the luxury of time. If we wait too long, the city's fate will be sealed. We move now, or we never get another chance." Carter nodded, despite the fear gnawing at him. The colonel had been right about one thing. They couldn't wait any longer. The enemy was closing in. And they were the only ones who could stop it. The night air was thick with tension as they approached the politician's mansion. The guards were stationed at strategic points. But the colonel had a plan. He knew how to bypass their security, how to strike silently, without alerting the entire compound. "I'll take the back entrance," the colonel said. "Carter, you're with me. Barnes, you'll provide cover from the east. If anything goes wrong, don't hesitate. We need to be fast and precise." Carter's heart pounded as he followed the colonel through the darkness. Every step calculated. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering gates a reminder of the wealth and power the man inside wielded. But that didn't matter now. It wasn't about money. It was about taking down the system, brick by brick. As they neared the back of the mansion, the colonel motioned for Carter to stay close. They approached a narrow service entrance hidden behind thick ivy. The colonel pulled a small device from his pocket and expertly disabled the security alarm with a few quick movements. "We're in," the colonel whispered. They slipped inside the building, moving through the dimly lit halls like ghosts. Carter's senses were on high alert, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He hadn't been in a mission this dangerous in years. Everything felt different. Like they were walking on the edge of a cliff. They reached the main floor, where the politician's office was located. The colonel signaled for Carter to stay back as he pushed open the door, revealing the man seated at his desk. Unaware of the intruders, the room was opulent, filled with expensive furniture and works of art that spoke of the politician's power. "Now," the colonel murmured. Before the politician could even react, the colonel moved swiftly, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him to his feet. Carter stepped into the room, his gun trained on the man as the colonel's voice cut through the silence. "You're done," the colonel said, his voice cold as steel. "It's over. We know everything." The politician's face drained of color as he stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room for an escape that wasn't coming. His fingers twitched, reaching for a hidden button under the desk. But the colonel was faster. With a flick of his wrist, the colonel disabled the panic button, ensuring that no one would be able to warn the rest of the security detail. Carter took a step forward, keeping his gun steady. "We've got the evidence," the colonel continued, his tone growing more intense. "We know about your deals with the syndicates, your connections to the highest levels of crime, and we're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The politician's lips trembled, his eyes now filled with fear. You don't know what you're doing. You'll never get away with this." The colonel leaned in close, his gaze hard and unyielding. "That's where you're wrong. We've already won." But just as the colonel was about to deliver the final blow to the politician's empire, an unexpected noise erupted from behind them. The door to the office slammed open, and two heavily armed guards burst into the room, guns drawn. The situation had just escalated. Carter's heart pounded as the guards advanced. But before he could react, the colonel moved with terrifying speed. He lunged toward the nearest guard, taking him down in an instant, his hand gripping the man's throat before he could even pull the trigger. Carter quickly fired at the second guard, taking him down with a well-aimed shot to the chest. The room was filled with the ringing sound of gunfire. And then, silence. For a moment, no one moved. The adrenaline still coursed through Carter's veins, his mind racing with the realization of what they had just done. They were on the brink now. There was no turning back. The colonel turned to him, his expression calm despite the chaos. "You did good, Carter, but this is just the beginning." As they made their way to the exit, the politician's fate sealed and the guards neutralized. They heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. "Time to move," the colonel said, his voice unwavering. "We need to get out of here. Now." The three of them bolted through the back exit, disappearing into the night as the city's sirens wailed, signaling the start of a new, uncertain chapter. The storm they had unleashed was just beginning, and they had no idea where it would lead. But one thing was certain: their fight was far from over. The three of them raced through the shadows, slipping through narrow alleyways and side streets, their every move calculated. The sound of police sirens grew louder, the distant wail of approaching vehicles a constant reminder that time was running out. They had made their move, but the repercussions were just beginning to unfold. As they reached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the colonel paused, turning to look at Carter and Barnes. His face was unreadable, but there was a certain finality in his gaze. "We've done all we can for tonight," the colonel said, his voice low and deliberate. "But this is only the beginning. There's more to be done. We've uncovered the first layer. But the people behind this, those who pull the strings, are still out there." Carter felt the weight of the colonel's words settle over him. They had struck a powerful blow. But now they had a target on their backs. He knew the city would never be the same again. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Carter said quietly, his voice tinged with doubt. "We've exposed a system that's been in place for decades. The people who are behind this, they won't just let us walk away." Barnes, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We've got no choice now. Carter, we've crossed the line. There's no going back. But if we stop now, all of this, everything we've risked, will have been for nothing." The colonel stepped forward, placing a hand on Carter's shoulder. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about the people, the ones who've been oppressed, the ones who've suffered at the hands of a system that's rigged against them. We can make a difference. But we have to stay focused." Carter nodded, his resolve hardening. He had already crossed too many lines to turn back. Whatever came next, he had no choice but to follow through. The following days were a blur of chaos and danger. News outlets buzzed with reports of the scandal that had rocked the city. The politician they had targeted was arrested, his ties to criminal organizations exposed for the world to see. But even as the authorities began to investigate, it was clear that the true puppet masters, the ones who had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes, were still out there, pulling the strings. The colonel's network of allies grew stronger as they carefully fed more information to the press, exposing corruption at every level of government. But with each revelation came more enemies. Those in power weren't going to go down without a fight. One evening, as Carter and Barnes were preparing for another mission, the colonel called them into the back room of their safe house. "We've received intel," the colonel said, his face grave. "The ones behind everything, they're getting desperate. They're going to make a move soon. And when they do, they won't hesitate to eliminate us. Then we'll be ready," Barnes said, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of worry in his eyes. The colonel looked at them both, his expression somber. "This is it. We've gone as far as we can in the shadows. It's time to take the fight to them, head on." The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. The colonel, Barnes, and Carter infiltrated a heavily guarded compound on the edge of the city, an underground network that housed some of the most powerful figures in the syndicate. It was a fortress, but they had the element of surprise on their side. They moved quickly, taking out guards as they went, until they reached the heart of the compound, a high-tech control room filled with monitors, each one showing a different part of the city. The colonel's eyes scanned the room, his focus unshakable. "There they are," he muttered, pointing to a set of figures on one of the screens. "The ones pulling the strings." Carter's heart pounded as he recognized some of the faces, powerful men and women who had been untouchable for years. They were the final piece of the puzzle. And now they were within reach. The fight was fierce. The colonel moved with lethal precision, taking down enemies in a blur of motion. Barnes covered his back, while Carter, with his gun drawn, kept an eye on their surroundings. The tension was unbearable, each second bringing them closer to the final showdown. At last, they cornered the leaders of the syndicate in a secure room at the center of the compound. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the unmistakable crackle of tension. The colonel stepped forward, his gaze cold and unwavering. "You've been pulling the strings for too long," the colonel said, his voice echoing through the room. "This ends tonight." The leader of the syndicate, a man known for his ruthlessness, sneered, "You think you can stop us? We own this city. We own everything." The colonel's lips curled into a grim smile. "Not anymore." With one swift motion, the colonel raised his weapon and fired. The leader of the syndicate fell to the ground, his reign over the city finally coming to an end. But the battle wasn't over yet. The remaining operatives moved to retaliate. But the colonel, Barnes, and Carter fought with everything they had left, their movements fueled by a single, unified purpose: to dismantle the corrupt system that had held the city in its grip for so long. As the dust settled, and the final enemies were subdued, Carter stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The colonel, though wounded, stood tall, his face resolute. "We did it," Barnes said, his voice low but filled with awe. The colonel nodded slowly. "Yes, but the fight doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. The city has been given a second chance, but only if we continue to fight for it." Carter looked around at the wreckage of the compound, his mind racing. They had won, for now. But the road ahead was uncertain. They had exposed the corruption, but there was still much to be done. The city was fractured, and it would take time to rebuild what had been broken. But one thing was certain: they had sparked something in the heart of the people. A revolution had begun, and there was no stopping it now.